We just finished talking about cropping. Now we're going to talk about saving and saving for the web in specific. Now, if you are working in Photoshop and you already have a bunch of adjustment layers and you want to make sure that you save your PSD properly, just in case you don't remember where we went over that, let me replicate something that would be a typical workflow. Like I said here, you might have a few layers and you want to save your progress so that you can come back to this document anytime you want to make revisions or continue your workflow. So the first thing that you definitely have to do is go to File, Save As, and save it as a PSD. So we will call this anything we want with the Save As caption here. And you can name it to literally anything as long as it doesn't have any special characters. So we can add a 101 extension .psd, and under your desktop I'll hit save. As you notice, the file name itself also changed on the top to give you an idea of what's happening. Now let's say that you want to save any further changes going forward on your PSD. So let's say I make another adjustment layer here, I change another curve, or whatever it is that you do. You can then go back, instead of saying File Save As, you can just say Save. And what that'll do is overwrite that same PSD so that it contains all your previous layers and any revisions. So it gives you like a most up-to-date version of any work that you've done. So if I hit Save, it shows you the percentage as it's working in the background and it saves. If you have an older version of Photoshop, what might happen is it doesn't save in the background. It'll give you a bar that it's saving right in the middle of your screen, so you can't actually do any further work as it's saving. And that's the beauty of having more of the recent updates of Photoshop, is you can save in the background, continue working as it's saving, and it'll be fine as well. All right, let's pretend that we tend to have a working file and we like the changes we've made to the image. This is obviously something I wouldn't necessarily do, but for demonstration purposes, it gives you an idea of coming to a conclusion and saving for the web and exporting a JPEG for different purposes. Now for me personally, I feel that saving for the web requires you to pay special attention to your file size. When you upload to the web, you want to make sure that it's not in full resolution, because it ends up taking a lot of bandwidth for people who are visiting your website, and it slows down the loading of your images. Having a website that's really fast and quick makes it really friendly to use, so more people visit it, and I get more clients that way as well. So let's go ahead and first and foremost talk about the various methods of resizing and saving. The first method of saving for the web would be going into Export and Save for the web. It might be for you that it's under File and Save for the web, so keep that in mind as Creative Cloud has changed a few of the locations where these options are. But for me, it's under File, Export, and Save for the web. The reason I'm using this first is it seems like most people who have Photoshop has at least Save for the web available. And this is a very common and easily used format for people who want to save quickly without having a lot of hassle. The first thing that we want to do is come down to image size. As you can see here, the image size itself is in full resolution at the moment because it says 100%. If you know the exact pixel width and height you want to use, you can go ahead and enter that here, and it scales proportionally because it's linked with these two arrows here. So if I change this to 1000, it changes the height as well to 667 because it's the same ratio. Or you can change the percentage. So I can go back and change this to, say, 25%. Now, with your website, you pretty much know exactly what width and height you want to use. If you don't, I would recommend checking into that and seeing what optimally the resolution should be. For me personally, I like to keep it as big as it allows without uploading it even bigger, because it might show smaller on the web, but it's loading the full resolution image. So for instance, I'll keep it really low. Let's say I know that it's 1000 on the long end, and I want to keep it as a JPEG. But the quality itself, I don't want to keep it at 100. And the reason for that is, although it'll save in the highest quality, it might be bigger than it should be. It might be something like maybe 3 or 4 megs or 5 megs if you reduce the quality. At 100% right now, it might be even higher, maybe 10 to 15 megabytes. The optimal setting for me is keeping it at 85%. And again, this is only if I know that I'm not going to be using this to make changes on top of the JPEG again. This is only if I'm going to be exporting this and uploading it straight to the web. So I'll change this to 85%. My width and height will be the exact amount that I want. And lastly, I will convert to sRGB. Next, the quality itself, I'll keep it to what we said earlier, or keeping it as default. And the reason for this is, like we mentioned earlier, in the settings where we're changing it from bicubic smoother to bicubic, we talked a little bit about the differences in your preferences section. So I'll keep it to whatever it was by default in your settings. And then I'll hit either save, and then it gives me a location indicator. So I can say export to the desktop, and I'll put the web extension. I'll hit save, and then it exports it out of Photoshop into the desktop. So if I now go into my desktop, it has my file right here. And if you notice, it's actually quite a light file now. And the reason is, obviously, because it is a smaller image at 1000 pixels in width. However, the quality setting itself was the reason why it actually became much lighter than it could be. So that's one way of saving it for the web. Another way is going under File, Export, and Export As. This again is a new feature in Creative Cloud that they came up with. And the reason for that is it gives you a more, I guess a compressed version with less settings, but it makes it really quick and easy to use. So I can check my format here, my quality here. I could drop that to whatever it is that I want, say 85. Whoops. Let's change that. Okay. And I can change my width and height, or I can change my scale like we talked about. This I'm not going to touch. And then convert to sRGB. So as you can see, it was exactly the same as Save for the Web, except there's even less settings here because it's only the ones that are most applicable to us photographers. And I think the reason for that is they actually saw what we're using Save for the Web for, and you put Export As into Photoshop to give us a more easier to use version of Save for the Web. So that's another version. And when you hit Export All, it asks you where it's going to save to, and you do the same thing again. And finally, there's a third version. If I go to File, Export, it gives me this quick export version. Now this is even a quicker version than what we discussed before. This is actually going to be inputted in your preferences. So for instance, if we go to Photoshop, Preferences, and in PC I believe it's under Edit Preferences, and you'll see the same categories. We'll go to General. Under Export. So after General, come down to Export, and you can already input your settings that you typically want to export as. And you hit quality of 85% or whatever if you want to keep it to, In case you want to keep it for archiving, you can keep it at 100. And then you hit OK. Make sure Convert to sRGB is checked. The reason why you want sRGB as your color space is because sRGB is a format that's easily readable by internet browsers and phones so that the colors stay pretty much intact on how you see it on your screen. That's I think the biggest fundamental takeaway is Adobe RGB, as we're working on it from the Camera Raw section, seems to be a color space that contains more colors. However, it's not readable by the web or phones in most instances. So you want to convert it to this sRGB color space so that it's readable by many formats and interfaces. So I always check that when I do something, anything for the web. And then when I go to export and quick export as JPEG, it then just prompts me where to save. So it's the most watered down, simplistic version of exporting JPEGs from Photoshop. The difference here is it'll only export it as a full resolution file. So the entire parameters of width by height, that's 7000 by 4000, and it just shrinks the quality down from 100 to 85%. So for me personally, I feel like the best setting is export as. Again, as a quick recap, if you're working on a Photoshop file and you want to save all your progress, File, Save As, and save as a Photoshop format. If your file becomes really heavy, over 2 gigabytes, go to Photoshop and go down under Photoshop and hit Large Document Format. That is the extension PSB. That stands for Photoshop Big. And this way, it'll allow you to read and save files that become larger than 2 gigabytes. But for most instances, save it as the Photoshop format. Another format that also saves layers is going down here and saving it as TIFF. The main difference is that Photoshop or .psd or .psb is only read mostly by Photoshop or Adobe products. .tiff is also layered and in some cases lighter than PSB, some cases heavier, but it's not proprietary and universally read. So in case you have other programs that you want to read your layer stack in, like Capture One, for instance, you can save it as a TIFF file and it'll save your layers as well. Personally, I like to keep it as Photoshop because some clients recommend me sending files in a .photoshop format. So again, saving your progress is with Photoshop, and then you hit save after naming it accordingly. And then exporting to the web is a JPEG and saving it as an 85 quality using one of the file and export settings or save for the web settings. Lastly, if you decide that you want to keep an archival copy in the highest format, for instance, let's say you're done with your PSD document and you want to export this as the highest resolution file possible without any layers. You can go under Layer, Flatten Image, and that'll compress everything we've done. And then you can go to Save As. Do not hit Save because it's going to overwrite all your layers. Save As, and then save it as a TIFF. Because a TIFF contains the most information possible in the highest quality. And then you can name that and use the extension Archive or Final, something to make sure you're differentiating anything you're saving. Because I think the worst thing that can happen is you end up saving multiple copies of your image and you don't know what the difference is. So make sure you keep everything layered and named. We just finished talking about saving and saving for the web. In the next section, we're going to talk about other palettes in Photoshop.